as you remember, last week we were reviewing the major, what I call chapters, in which the whole idea of design, what I call the design consciousness, evolved. And we got all the way through what I call the development of industrial design, the industrialization, or maybe more to the point, design for an industrialized economy, where things are being manufactured in volumes rather than one at a time. And the next sort of significant shift is towards what I called human-centered discipline, chapter 4. It's where we are now. We started it last week. I'll go through it again in brief up to that point. And really all that human-centered discipline was a sort of a central realization within all of the design professions. And there's people still not quite on board with this, and this is still an evolution in process that, you know, I just said it earlier on, that design isn't actually about the artifact. It's not about the thing that you're designing. It's more essential to focus on the people that you're designing the things for. Because if we don't understand the people we're designing for, the designs are just going to be perfunctory, decorative, and really not having any real purpose in our society. And the point of design, going back to the chapter 1, is it's an evolutionary principle. It's how we adapt to our environment and how we adapt our environment to ourselves. We've been doing that for millions of years. And we've gotten to the point that we've reduced it down to a specific discipline. That process of adaptation, that process of making things work, making things fit in a very deliberate and intentional way. So the idea that we sort of got lost in us all the way through the most of the period of what I call industrial design was that it wasn't about things. It wasn't about just making an object. It was about serving people in a particular way. And the whole notion of human-centered, user-centered, customer-centered design has become more of a standard that people can subscribe to. And so a lot of the processes that we're going to be learning are really centered on human-centered design principles. Just a bit of history of that, all the way back to the beginning of the emergence of the design professions that we'll discover in the next lecture. A field called human factors emerged, a field that said we need to study people so when we're designing systems for them, we understand them better. At its emergence, human factors emerged really as an adjunct discipline to engineering, to two different kinds of engineering. In the Second World War, as airplanes were being developed as war machines, there was a realization that the performance of these machines was very, very closely related to not how fast they could go and how aeronautically or aerodynamically stable they were, but more importantly, how well they could be controlled by an operator, by a pilot. And it was established and discovered really quickly that all the engineering of the machine aside, the military was getting terrible results from terribly designed cockpits. And so one branch of human factors was really an extension in the beginning of aeronautic design, aircraft design. And very quickly that became a principle of designing controls for things like power stations and any kind of complex system where people had to relate to a high performance, low tolerance of failure environment where the human factor, if you like, was super critical to nail down. But over time that broadened out, and over time the discipline of human factors engineering broadened out to include just about any product category. The flip side of that is another term that is used to describe human factors as actually the European tradition. Human factors was very much an American tradition and emerged in America as a profession. But in Europe, it emerged as a profession called ergonomics, which you probably have heard, ergonomic chairs, we talk about ergonomics in the way we use computers, in the way we interact with the mouse, with the screen, etc. So ergonomics was the discipline, literally the word ergonomics means the study of work. And what ergonomics as a human-centered science was doing was studying how people get work done, so they could initially, so they could work more efficiently, so they could work faster, so they could get more things made. And eventually, as the profession took hold, the focus became more and more so that they didn't injure themselves, so that they could be not brain dead by the end of the day, and that it was generally oriented to the well-being of the factory worker, of the people who were doing work. And as work changed, so the focus of ergonomics and human factors changed to include office work and the kind of cognitive disciplines that emerged out of that. And we'll talk about it later as the computer came on the scene. So very quickly in the design worlds, in the world of industrial design, for example, this fellow Henry Dreyfuss, who was one of the founding members of the industrial design profession in America, said, wait a minute, we need to reduce all these complex human factors to something simple that designers can use. And they created charts and graphs of what's called anthropometrics, the measure of the human body. It's not just the basic dimension, how tall am I and how short am I, but there's about 150 different measurements that are standardized for shoulder width, reach, length to the inside of the crotch, on and on, the finger sizes, etc. And it's all very statistically correlated with the what's called on a percentile graph. How many people are at the first percentile, at the 50th percentile, at the 95th percentile, etc. So when you're designing stuff, you're designing for particular kinds of people. But it was soon found that designing for one kind of person really isn't a good idea. So within this user-centered environment, different design thinkers started proposing that design should, and there's a lot of shoulds involved in design principles, designers should consider people of all kinds of ability. There should be more equity in design. We should be thinking about different kinds of people who've got limitations of function and limitations of ability, so that we design for them primarily, because it's assumed if someone has a weak grip, in the case of this OXO vegetable peeler, that an arthritic person, an elderly person who's trying to peel a potato, who's got arthritis in the hand, they're going to need a very broad grip to do that. Doing it with a small, thin, spindly grip is very, very hard. Turns out it's actually good for able-bodied people too. And so a lot of universal design principles came along to just say, let's extend the group of people from a narrow percentile to a very broad percentile. Let's try and include as many people as possible in what we design, how we design it, and what the ultimate result is. In the same vein, people started thinking in a much bigger sense about who is this person we're designing for. And this fellow, a man by the name of Roland Buckminster Fuller, and you'll be hearing his name a few times in a different contexts in this discussion. He's a monumental thinker, a great man who's an architect by training, but known as a mathematician. Those of you who've ever heard of a buckyball, it's a kind of a graphite structure. It's named after Buckminster Fuller because one of his prime accomplishments was he invented what's called the geodesic dome. You're seeing a big example of that behind him in this photograph. And he was very, very concerned with finding optimum structures in the world. But what he was even more concerned about was designing not just for any one human being, but for a planetary consciousness, for the planet as a whole. He wrote a book by the name of Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. It's an important book. Take that, make a note of that, check it out. You can find it online. And in which he advocated for what he called a design science. He advocated for actually reducing design to a science, which I've got problems with that formulation, but he was moving it in the right direction. He was saying, if we're going to be designing everything, which we are, and we're going to create the world, if you like, almost from a human experience point of view, in its totality, we need to understand what we're doing, and we need to do it much more precisely and effectively. And so he advocated for that back in the 60s and the 70s, even earlier, really, he was talking about in the 50s. And he left it as an idea on the table. But for him, the human-centered was all of us. The humanity, if you like, was the center of his concern at the broadest level. And then he reduced it down to solving individual human problems and human needs at the specific level, applying what he called a design science. So that was part of a movement towards reducing design to methods, so that we can have a book called Methods of Design, right? Universal Methods of Design. We're going to be spending quite a bit of, in fact, the most of the semester, we're going to be exploring I call it a method framework. It's not really a design method in itself. It's a framework for applying many, many methods called design thinking. Could I just get actually an indication how many of you are familiar with design thinking, if you even know what that is? Actually, I don't have a, can I just get Lucas, is that something you're familiar with? No? Oh, let's see, who else can I find here? Oh God, I don't have a cursor again. All right, well, I can't do the call around. But anyway, so I like to say that the design method or the development of a methodical way of doing design, a systematic way of doing design, a systematic approach to it, is to our creativity what the development of the design method was to our curiosity. And for those of you who know about the design method, back in the 17th century, people like Sir Isaac Newton formulated a particular and put forward the idea that all science should be done within a particular methodical framework called the scientific method. The idea that all science should be based on a conjecture that leads to a hypothesis, that leads to a study of the real world, that leads to either a refutation or a support for the hypothesis, and then on to the next stage of knowledge acquisition. And that the way knowledge would advance is that many people working on similar questions would all research it independently of each other. And where there's a lot of overlap of findings, then you're approaching knowledge. Not the truth, but you're approaching knowledge. And that's the basis of the scientific method. What we know that has happened, no, I'm not going to go there, is that the progress of science, once we had a method, took off astronomically, right? We know our science is so massively more advanced today than it was at the time of Sir Isaac Newton. And so at that time, science had been moving along fairly slowly. So we're already seeing it now with the application of a design method, our ability to design complex systems, complex products, and even simple ones that have, if you like, complex cultural effects, has expanded dramatically. And it's a really important tool for understanding how the next 50, 60 years, century is going to go. Because it's the first time really in history that we've had a methodical way of going about creating every artifact that we make. And it's really out of this phase, this human-centered phase of the design story, that we got to there. So much so that now, again, a familiarity, there's a school down a little school down the peninsula called Stanford. You might have heard of it. They have a thing called the D School. And all that the D School does is teach this method, this method framework to everybody at the university. It teaches to the doctors, it teaches it to the lawyers, it teaches it to the engineers, et cetera, et cetera. The assumption is that everybody who's involved in creative work, which is everybody, it's not just designers, it's engineers, it's scientists, it's lawyers, it's doctors. All of them need to understand a systematic and methodical way of going through the creative process. especially in a human-centered framework. And so that really has been established. The fellow that you're seeing there is actually one of the founders of the D School and the founding director of the Department of Design Research. The idea that there's a specific research into how design happens most effectively and how to make it better. And again, this is a very new thing. I think I mentioned in my introductory remarks about myself, is that's actually my background. I went from a studies in industrial design to studies in design research, learning how to both apply research methods to the design process and then also to research the design process itself to make it better and more effective. So we see that in this fourth chapter, the consciousness of design is human-centered. We've suddenly come to realize it's really about people and not about the things. The practices are professionally specialized, and we're going to be talking a lot about that in the next lecture. The process is human-centered, and innovation has just skyrocketed in this period. And we know that, you know, back in the 50s and the 60s, when Buckminster Fuller was talking about things, having a phone at all was a big deal. And we've gone through 10, 15 generations of phones, so that now we all carry a very sophisticated communication computer around in our pockets. And it's come along tremendously with massive amounts of technology that have been innovated to result in this little simple slab of plastic and glass and metal. So that's the fifth chapter. And the last chapter, the chapter that I believe we're in right now, the one that's really just taking root, is what I call dematerialization. One of the things that happened when computers came along is they drew attention to the fact they weren't the first example where we actually started designing things that don't actually physically exist in the world, but they brought attention to it so that we had to start thinking about it in a more structured and a more deliberate way. You can see how that would happen. One of the things that a computer consists of, beside a box with a bunch of hardware in it, is software. The idea that a tool, an artifact exists that has no physical reality at all was a pretty new idea to actually think through. And so disciplines emerged to allow people to design software. And once they start, you designed the software, you came to realize that behind the software is not really the software that matters, it's the experience that you're giving people. If you apply a human-centered perspective to software, but to computers and to anything, you ultimately realize that the thing you're designing, the thing that you're creating from scratch, is a different kind of experience that people are going to have. And so experience design has become a field. It's a discipline. We'll talk about that. It's a thing you can do. You can study to design experiences. And here's an example of that, where people have designed the entry experience for children into a children's hospital, because it turns out that a big cause of problems in children's health is they just don't want to go into these sterile, unfriendly, cold environments. So a lot of thought and attention has been given to how to design environments for children in hospitals, for adults in hospitals, in all kinds of scenarios, but to get specific to the kinds of people who are going to use the artifact. The idea that an entire entry experience, an entry sequence, is itself an artifact of design, is part of this dematerialization. Imagineering is the most famous experience design organization that I know of. Disney has been in the experience design business forever, really. As soon, once they got beyond their animation phase, and they were just making animation movies, they realized they had an experience to offer the world, and they created an organization within Disney called the Imagineering. And Imagineering's job was to come up with ideas for theme parks, for rides on the theme park, and for the entire experience that people would have when they came to those places, so that it was fun, engaging, educational, all the things that Disney wanted to put into it. We design businesses now. There are multiple methodologies that have emerged for designing the business itself that's going to produce all of these wonderful artifacts that people are going to enjoy in the world. These are two examples of design tools for business. One is called, the one that's very widely used and very, very broadly applied. If we had time, I would insist on you actually going through a business canvas exercise, but we're not going to have time for that. So if you have a chance to check it out, check it out. It's a very simple thing. It really takes all the parameters of a good business, puts it into a convenient graphic format, and then insists that the business planning, rather than sitting down and writing a 400-page business plan, if you've got an idea for a business, go through it as a design exercise. Do it iteratively. Do all the things that we're about to learn about how to design a brand. Do it with the business as a whole. Define your value proposition, understand the key activities, partners, etc., etc. And over time, iterate it so you get more and more refined and more detailed. And as you go through the prototyping and development, you expand on what you know about the business that you're designing. So you're designing from something very, very schematic and conceptual down to the finest detail. And that is a pattern that within design thinking as a framework of design method is applied all across the board to businesses, all the way to the logo of the company. All right.
Yeah, let's take a break soon.
I'm almost finished. We're gonna wrap up. Thank you. So virtual reality is real. It's, you know, if you like, everything we've created is an artifact of the human imagination. It was only a question of time where we'd actually dissolve the physical aspect of it and make it entirely virtual. And so virtual reality is a thing we design. We design things into spaces that we can't physically interact with. I think it's only a question of time before we'll be designing virtual reality environments that absolutely can't exist in the physical world. We're just scratching the tip of that iceberg right now, but we're going to be designing more and more into virtual space. And augmented reality, we're going to be designing spaces and experiences and artifacts that stand between ourselves and the world that we're entering in. We're going to be using that interstitial space through software, but eventually we're going to be using it through headgear that we're just going to be walking through the world. The question always is going to have to be, is it good for people? How do you serve people by doing that? Not just can you come up with a fancy new idea, but can you serve people? Can you make it human-centered? And that's always going to be the challenge as we keep on breaking up technologies into these dematerialized forms. We're going to be designing drugs. Drugs are themselves, you've heard it referred to designer drugs. We're going to be designing drugs. We've got genetic engineering. We're going to be designing in a very deliberate way. We're going to be designing the food we eat. You know, we've been doing that for 12,000 years. That's how we got agriculture. We used the original genetic engineering process of essentially sort of agricultural practices and animal husbandry practices where you select out for the strongest gene lines that you want to have so you can domesticate animals and plants. Well, we've done that for 12,000 years, and it's just in the last 40, 30 that we've actually learned to do it at the genetic level, at the molecular level. And so we're applying this exact same processes that we do to designing a lobby of a hospital, to designing a drug to cure cancer. And it's being used widely just in that way. So we're in a consciousness now where the consciousness is about the system as a whole. It's not even just about the human being at the center of it. It's about how we relate to the environment, how we relate to the context that we're in. The practices are multidisciplinary. You can't do this kind of design, one person sitting, sketching a nice logo, right? Or one person's idea of a house. things are just way complicated. And you'll find in the large organizations that are doing very innovative work, even the simplest thing is produced by complex, large teams consisting of many, many disciplines working together. And that really is the world that you're all going to be graduating into. The process is ecologically driven. If it's a systems thinking, ecology is the science of systems. And so understanding how we relate to the environment, you know, here in San Francisco, we just felt Armageddon for the last 3 or 4 days as the place was almost burning down. We had orange skies. And so we know we're going to have a more ecologically driven frame of mind as we design these complex, dematerialized and virtualized systems. And innovation in this context, well, if you've ever heard people talk about the technological singularity, there are people who believe there is absolutely no limit to innovation. We can create anything we want. And the question that I have when you say we can create anything we want, and that's as a group of design managers and people coming into the design world, the question isn't what can we get there? The question is, what do we want? Because if we want to create terrible things, we will create terrible things. And the challenge that we have when you get into an environment where anything is possible, you start having to really think hard about what we want and what we're going to do. All right, so that is a good place for a break. There's a lot to think about, a lot to settle in there. I'll be happy to take questions either individually after this or later on while we take the break if you just want to yell out some questions. But let's take a minute or two straight.